I think the most important thing to know about finance is it's not how we feel about it that matters. It's that we have an obligation to use to grow the assets that we have to make the world a better place from where we are right now, wherever that is. And that's our job. But one is that almost anybody can get into finance. And I've seen people with zero background if they're interested. And a lot of what really leads, in my experience, to success in finance and to progress is if you either find it interesting or choose to be interested. It's curiosity about it.
Welcome to Wyden Publishers Podcast. Our guest for today is Andrew Heshenkens, a powerhouse of talent. With a background in physics, a successful corporate career, and now as an entrepreneur and finance lecturer, he brings a unique perspective to the table. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Very glad to be here.
So, our topic for today is finance for beginners. And I would like to start off by asking you to give us a brief about some essential financial concepts that everyone should know, regardless of their financial goals.
Yeah, finance is such a funny thing because in some ways it can be very intimidating and people feel like they have to know everything to know anything. But there really are a few ideas that you can apply to really any career or even just in your personal life that are really effective. The simplest one is people always talk about this time value of money thing. But the reality of that one is what it is trying to capture is that we have a responsibility, if we have resources, to put them to good use. And that over time, if resources are put to good use, they become more valuable rather than less valuable. And that's all it is. We say the time value of money to try to sort of shortcut that idea. So I think that's one of the most basic in all of finance is this obligation or duty to put those whatever resources we have, our time, our um, uh, if we have actual cash, if we have a building or a business or an idea or a patent or just about anything that can create new value, we should create new value. It's a duty or an obligation.
Understood. Now, for the young audience listening to this podcast, to break into the world of finance, what kind of background is typically needed? What skills and interests are most beneficial for success in this career?
That's a really interesting question for a bunch of reasons. But one is that almost anybody can get into finance. And I've seen people with zero background if they're interested. And a lot of what really leads, in my experience, to success in finance and to progress is if you either find it interesting or choose to be interested. It's curiosity about it. If you like business, if you like um, uh, building value and figuring out the mechanisms and the process of creating value, that's the most important thing, is that curiosity. To be able then to build that, a lot of it is sort of two different categories. The first is if you are reading the news, the business news on a regular basis, you start to get sort of a repertoire of understanding what happens, what's going on out in that business world. And first, that makes it a lot more interesting when you know, oh yeah, this company is working with that company, or they created this whole new product, or there's another 100 jobs over here that got added because of demand for this new product. That stuff's actually really interesting. And so reading is a way to start to get a feel for how does business happen? How do things move forward? But secondly, people can get a lot of background from just taking small steps of engagement. One is make sure that your own assets are reasonably put to use, that you're not heavily in expensive debt, you don't have too much credit card spending, or that whatever your savings are are thoughtfully put to good use and growing the best they can. And that goal or effort is a lot of what finance is about. We want to accomplish the goal of how do we best grow this asset that we have. So start by doing it with whatever assets you have. So learning about what others are doing and then doing what we can ourselves, small steps. I find that people that have read about the business world and tried to do something are really the ones that succeed the most.
Okay, and so what about the educational paths that one can take and experiences which are valuable if you could share?
Sure. So one of the neat things is there's a lot of opportunities to learn about. Of course, I teach at Boston College, and so we have a undergraduate program in finance and a graduate program in finance. So you can study at any level that you want to and take that to getting a PhD in finance. But the the simplest starting points are that there are plenty of online work, online courses available to begin to learn about how does finance function, what are the various job opportunities within it, what are the categories of areas in which to work. But then I would also start saying, reading about the areas that interest you most. There's great books out there. Um, Marx has written a great books, not Carl, the other one. A lot of people have written lots of really interesting things about investment category is one of the biggest. But then you start to say, okay, well, now I can learn more. There are conferences to go to. And certainly, if it turns out to be a real area of interest, taking college courses or getting either a minor or even a major in finance is a really powerful way to move yourself forward in business. Those tools, even if you're not ending up purely in the finance field, say as an investment banker or working in investment advisory or as a treasurer or controller for a company, all those finance skills are still very applicable, whether you're in marketing or in a nonprofit or government. Those are really still important things to know.
Understood. Now, from your experience as a lecturer, how do you ensure that students understand complex and interconnected topics in the field of finance when they're taking a basic course? And if you could share your methods and strategies that you find effective.
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one because finance can be a very complicated subject if you can take it as far as you want. But one of the things that I find works really well in learning it is beyond the curiosity is to accept some things as true. When you're first learning it, some stuff doesn't always make sense. You might say, oh, well, why is this bond worth that much? Or why is a stock priced the way it is? And if you begin just by saying, okay, well, I'm going to learn that for now. And as I go on in it, learning more about finance, that will probably make more sense. So a certain acceptance is kind of necessary because it is so interconnected. But I also find that the broader people have read, the more everything makes sense, even the little things. So if we start talking about, all right, I have an annuity or a bond or a stock, and I want to understand the value of those things, that comes a lot from saying, okay, I know where stock fits in. Stock is how companies raise money. And it's also from the other side. Every transaction has two sides. And from the other side, it's how an investor says, oh, I have these assets. I want to put them to their best and highest use. So I'm going to invest there. And as we get that broader picture and start to understand, okay, if you just study what's the price of a stock, all you're looking at is one little piece of what is in fact an interaction between a business and an individual, or a business and a whole portfolio of stocks, it starts to make a lot more sense. So I think because of that interconnectedness, having that a broad picture that says, yeah, we We aren't just looking at one little tiny dot. We're looking at something that's part of a really big picture. Money's flowing, obligations and legal responsibilities are flowing, assets are flowing, and that makes a big difference as we try to understand how do we think about finance. We think about it as this solution to basic problems, but the answers are sometimes not that basic. To have a stock market, for example, is actually a pretty sophisticated thing, and it didn't happen for a very long time. So people traded and engaged in business for thousands of years before we had what might be called a stock market. So the
Right.
solutions we have today are pretty complex solutions to the ordinary problems that we face, but they're actually pretty good.
Correct. So you would you agree that patience is required a lot while starting with finance, because it will require time for things to connect, since
Yes.
it's such an interconnected topic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Patience, we're not always patient, but yes, we need it.
Correct. Now, I would like to know your opinion on this. Is there an advantage to starting your finance career with a fresh perspective, or does experience hold more weight?
Wow. Well, I'm a little biased because I started as a physicist, and so I had no background at all, and then kind of got thrown into it. And it's both good and bad because I did start with fresh perspective and was able to ask questions that nobody else was asking because I didn't have enough background to make the assumptions everyone else did.
Right.
And sometimes that's really helpful. Um, but it also means it took me longer to see all the interconnections. So I guess I would argue for as much background as you can get, but wherever you start, you come to the world where you are today. And so I think there's pluses and minuses.
Okay. Got it. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Now, I want to know, why is finance divided into so many subfields? There's personal finance, corporate investments, and how do these all of these interconnect?
Oh yeah, it is. It's so siloed and chopped up, and the people in one group never talk to the people in another. It drives me nuts. It's
Right.
it's unnecessarily divided and subdivided and subdivided. In the investment world, there's people that are doing government bonds and people that are doing corporate bonds and people that are doing municipal bonds, and they don't even know each other. They don't talk to each other at all. So it's kind of crazy. A good friend of mine is a bond trader, and he just did municipals. And I would ask him a question about a regular federal government bond, a national bond, and he was, I don't know anything about it. I've heard of them, but I don't know them. So it's um, in part because they don't have to interact with each other. We've built these systems where one can go in and buy and sell bonds in the bond market, for example, without ever knowing that on the other side there's an actual hospital that's borrowing money to build a hospital, or a company that's borrowing money to expand their market into um, another area, or uh, the people don't seem to have to interact because of the way we've built out the markets. And there's reasons for that. Part of it is we don't want um, corruption to seep in. We don't want people to uh, be making transactions with known parties because they might not be made at what we could call an arm's length transaction, meaning completely free of
Hmm.
biases and just based on a
Right.
fair price, not because I know them or because I have a connection with that person. So the markets are effective, but they also tend to chop things up into little bits. Um, it's funny. When I was I during college, I had gotten injured, took time off from school, and I worked as a commodity broker. And I had a bunch of friends who traded commodities in the commodity pits in New York, which is a pretty chaotic place. Chicago was the same way in the olden days. And there were fist fights and things. A friend of mine came back without his front teeth because they got into a fight during what was the price for corn. But he traded on the corn exchange and didn't know anybody from the beef exchange or the pork exchange, or, any of the things that were being traded, all were separated. And so part of it's just that the industry is really large. Part of it's that whole market thing, but part of it's also that there's so many people involved and it's so big that it's hard to really wrap our heads around all the different interconnected pieces. That's one of the important things I think about education, is why it's so important as a field to study, is to see it from that very high level and understand the interconnections, because they can make a big difference as you go into the work, even though you're working in a very narrow area. Seeing that broader picture through education is really critical.
Correct. Understood. Is it necessary to have knowledge of all the fields, or would you suggest sticking to just one field?
I think that's a good question. I think for building expertise, you have to be in one field, and you become really great at buying stocks or at funding companies or whatever the category is. But I think we miss a lot of things if a lot of understanding and creative ways to solve problems if we don't study the broader markets as well and understand all of finance. And you don't have to understand it fabulously. You don't have to be an expert in everything, but to
Right.
know that it exists and to understand why, what role does accounting play in finance, and what role does regulatory play in finance, and how does finance world interact with government and with uh, nonprofits and with uh, all the different pieces that sort of feed and connect in. I think that makes us much better at our jobs and much better at our careers.
Understood. So then, why do you think what makes finance so difficult for some people?
Yeah, I try to ask my students that because I want them to think about that question, because it's a little bit different for everybody. We all have our own challenges. For me,
Correct.
because I was in physics originally, the math part of it was not an issue. It was more the interpersonal bits that were challenging. So each of us have our own things, but I think there's two big pieces that I get back from students in answer to that question. And the it's not that the math is super difficult, especially today, because we have all the tools. We all have our machines that do the calculations for us for the most part.
Now with Chat GPT and AI coming into the
Right.
picture.
Although we have to be careful about that. I've asked a lot of questions of Chat GPT, and it gets some of them right and some of them pretty wrong. So it's a little risky to rely on that.
Right.
But in finance, it isn't just the math that's complex. It's more how do we ask the question? How do we set up the problem so we're actually going to get a meaningful answer at the far end? If I want to understand, right now we're doing a transaction of buying a company, and the question of what's that company worth is a really critical question, because we're going to write this check and buy this company, and it matters a lot. A lot of money's at stake. So how do we decide what it's worth? Well, is it the time value of money, of course, plays in, the net present value of cash flows that we're not going to collect for years. What is the raw asset worth? What is it worth because it's a bunch of people that work well together? That has value as well. So figuring out how to ask the question is, and all the factors that go into the decision, I think is the single most common answer I get is, wow, I've got to think of a lot of things. there's a lot of important influences. So we have to think of cause and effect and reason it through. And that's just not easy. That's that's challenging. But
Right.
people play Call of Duty, or they do things that are difficult. So the fact that it's difficult isn't a shouldn't stop us. That actually, to me, is why it's so interesting. It's actually got a lot of neat features of it that I like to learn about and see. And uh, I'm an old guy, and I still find it uh, new things every day in finance because of that complexity. Um, but the other half of it is people worry a little bit about finance. Like, what if I get it wrong? And so I think people are a little nervous because it matters. If you get Call of Duty wrong, you know, you
You
reboot
restart.
and play again, right? You restart. But in finance, you don't have as much money if you get it wrong. And the answer is, well, that's totally true. But that means it's more serious. And so people um, have to be more thoughtful and more careful and more prudent and more broadly aware. And that's one of the great reasons to really have a broader picture and a good education in finance is you want to have that broad picture so you don't get surprised by things that you didn't think of.
Right. I agree with your point. And drawing from your experiences, which approach seemed to work best in learning finance?
I I really think that um, there's sort of two levels. One is you want to have a broad awareness. So you want to be reading in the business press. There's tons of stuff available online, and you want to have that just so you understand the ecosystem in which you operate. Well, how does this world of business sort of function? And it really helps to see lots and lots of transactions happen. This person made this decision. This person had these assets and made that choice. This person had this responsibility and decided this. So seeing that 1,000 times is critical. So that piece of the education. But I mean, clearly I teach, so I think that's important. I feel like sort of a concentrated, focused time period is the best way to learn finance because it is so interconnected and because there's so many pieces to it and so many silos of corporate and this kind of bond and that kind of stock. I think having all of that happen in a course, in a condensed course period, makes a big difference. It's hard to sort of spread that out over time and really have it all fit together in a way like a puzzle.
Understood. Now, I would like to shift the topic to the one which we were talking about, Chat GPT and AI. And what role do you think AI is going to play in terms of the financial world? And how is it going to maybe help, prove beneficial, or maybe have some bad effects? What is your opinion on that?
Ooh, I think it's going to have a massive effect, though. It's incredible. And seeing what it can do, it's going to have some very good and some maybe not so good effects. Um, Certainly, um, for example, we're doing this acquisition, buying a company, and I asked ChatGPT, what about this influence on um, this particular asset that we're buying? I was worried about and not very informed about. It was a whole category that I didn't understand very well. And it was really helpful to pull together stuff from all over the web and give me some answers. But some of them were really a little off. And I had to research and find out, oh yeah, okay, this part is exactly right. This is something I wouldn't have thought of. And here's something that when I read it, it doesn't quite make sense. So I researched that area more. So I think as a tool, it's really going to be helpful if we're, and here's where education comes in, because I've got some experience and some training in this. I was able to look at things and say, oh, that's not quite right. So I think the risk of it is if we just rely on it to do all our thinking for us, it's not good enough yet. And I don't know if and when it will be to just say, all right, we're going to hand it the reins. You Chat GPT, you make all the decisions.
Correct.
That's not going to be effective. We could do that, but I don't think it would be very smart. But I do think it's a huge help in identifying important areas to look at further, in helping us think through things that we might not know a lot about. And just in part because finance is so complicated and there's so many different pieces to it, you can't know everything. And supposedly I'm supposed to know a lot about it, but there's just no way to know the whole thing. So
Right.
it's useful. And it's funny because Chat GPT can also do bond calculations. I'll type it
Okay.
in and it'll do the calculation, and it's pretty good. It's not
Interesting.
perfect, but it is pretty good at that. Now I've gotten, because I do a lot of that kind of calculations, I can do a bond calculation on my calculator, and I'm under 8 seconds now. So is it faster? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. What I was saying is, you mentioned that how important interconnectedness is in finance. Don't you think that AI is going to be much more powerful in that aspect than us? I mean,
Yes.
when it comes
Yes.
to having that interconnectedness.
Yeah, I think if it's well trained, it's going to see things that we're just unaware of, and it's going to be
Right.
creative about those things that we just would miss, and say, oh, here's
Right.
another path, or here's a solution that you haven't considered, or um, it's um, it's an extension of our own brain. It's bigger and has more knowledge and more history, and can search through more stuff than we can in a whole lifetime. So I'm a huge fan of where this is going, because I think it's going to make us all better at finance. Wherever we start, I think it's going to make us better.
Right. And I think a big revolution in stock market world must have come when everything got digitized, from papers to completely digital. Do you think that kind of effect might come to the stock market now with AI in picture?
Yes, I worked with an investor who bought the old computer from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, a big supercomputer, and he had it shipped into his house, and it had supercooling with liquid nitrogen and everything, because he wanted to look for patterns and try to understand things in the market. And I think, and that was a decade ago, and I think now what AI could do, uh, 1,000 times what he was able to do with the most sophisticated computer. And I think it'll help us better understand the markets, and it'll help us find opportunities in the markets that we otherwise just would never see.
Got it. Well, my last question to you is, what would be your single most important financial lesson that you wish everyone would know, regardless of their age or income level?
Oh, that is such a good question. I think the most important thing to know about finance is it it's not how we feel about it that matters. It's that we have an obligation to use to grow the assets that we have to make the world a better place from where we are right now, wherever that is. Um, and that's our job.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing your insights on the world of finance, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to talk with you.
Same here.